Hey, what's up everybody? Dan Pickett here at Launch Academy, here to bring you another episode of the HTML show. And today we're going to be talking about a very important subject that's really going to follow us through the remainder of the course. And we're going to start to move in more of a project orientation and work through some real world examples to practice the wonderful world of responsive web design. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to first take a look at why responsive web design is so important and why it's so meaningful for us as front-end web developers. Then we're going to look at a few different strategies for responsive web design and what we can incorporate as part of that process. And lastly, we're going to use one of the most important strategies, which is using media queries to basically have our web page layouts respond to various devices and orientations. So let's dive in and talk more specifically around why we need responsive web design. So back in my day, which was really a short time ago, trust me it was, really the only devices that were very usable on the web was a traditional desktop computer or laptop. But what we saw ever since the introduction really of the iPhone and BlackBerry devices, the need to be able to accommodate smaller screen sizes, different form factors, and really different ways to interact with the web. So what has emerged, and this term was coined by a wonderful front-end web developer named Ethan Marcotte, what has kind of come about is this idea and philosophy of responsive web design. So what we need to do as front-end engineers is adapt and modify our layouts so that it can adhere to the constraints of various web devices. So things like mobile devices, like my Galaxy here, things like the iPad mini, iPad Pro, and our traditional desktop computers all have different screen sizes and all have different capabilities. So one thing that we have to be cognizant of as web developers is that various users are going to be using different types of devices to essentially work with and interact with our web pages. So the need for responsive web design has emerged. And essentially what we need to do is build a web page that looks beautiful across all different web browsers and all different devices. So really with the emergence and proliferation of mobile devices, this idea and this concept of responsive web design has become increasingly important. So one thing that we started to do while iOS was first coming to the forefront is we actually started using JavaScript to sniff specifically for that browser in other mobile web browsers. And what we would do is we would actually redirect our users to a whole different web experience. And this was broken for a number of reasons. We had to create and duplicate our content for different presentations. And thankfully, with HTML5 and CSS, we no longer have to do that through the concepts of responsive design. So rather than browser sniff, as we like to call it, and essentially use JavaScript to detect a specific browser or a specific device, we can use the capabilities of the browser and sort of detect certain capabilities to respond to and adapt to the needs of our web browser. So rather than browser sniff, the emergence and proliferation of responsive web design has made us able to create one central set of semantic and well-formed HTML and manipulate that presentation using what's known as media queries and flexible layouts so that our users can still experience the same HTML markup but use different presentation and layout structure so that it looks great across mobile devices. So I thought it would be useful before we dive into the specifics to actually take a look at our website and see how it responds and changes to the needs of various mobile devices. And in doing so, what we're going to actually do is take a look at a wonderful tool that comes with, as you may have guessed, the Chrome DevTools, and it's called the Responsive Layout tool. So we're going to go ahead and dive in. And notice here I've pulled up our HTML webpage at launchacademy.com. And I'm using a rather wide display. In fact, I think the resolution of this display is somewhere around I think it's a 1080p resolution. So you're getting a very wide experience. And notice as I decrease the width of my HTML window or my viewport, the behavior in layout of my HTML web page changes. And this is really at the heart of what responsive web design is. You're going to write code, mainly in CSS, that is going to essentially adapt to the changing resolutions of our web pages and mobile devices. So let's make a few observations of what changes. Notice how the video kind of shrinks in size as I decrease the width of the page. And notice the Apply Today button, how that changes over time. And notice how the video, when I hit a certain point, changed to a lower or higher resolution video. So you can start to see how some of these things interact. Let's take a look at the nav and how the nav changes as we go from essentially 1,000 pixels of resolution to less than that. Notice we get a persistent nav bar, and this little what we call a hamburger navigation shows up. So this is the practice of responsive design. Our engineers have appropriately considered the possibility of the web browser being at a different resolution. And we utilize the practice of responsive web design to basically adapt and change to the needs of our end user. And thankfully, with the Chrome DevTools, we get a wonderful, wonderful diagnostic tool that can show us and teach us more about the responsive design philosophies and experience. So we're going to open up Chrome Inspector, and we're going to open up the device toolbar. And the device toolbar is going to change our actual browser window, and it's going to give us a couple things. By default, you're going to see this top bar here, and this is going to allow us to kind of move through different presets of devices. And you can see it's super helpful in providing us with the different resolution presets of popular mobile devices at the time of this recording. I also want you to show your device frame and show your media queries. This is going to be important as we talk about some of the tripwires and how our page changes as the resolution of our device changes. And lastly, I want to show you when you select the responsive mode, it actually gives us some sliders so that we can adjust the width of our viewport so that we can test how our web page changes at various breakpoints, which we'll talk about as we dive into the world of media queries. So let's talk about strategies for web responsive design. And what I'd like to do is I'd actually like to focus on this bootcamp guide form here. This is one component of our main web page at the time of this recording. And you can see how the behavior changes as the resolution of my display changes. So see that the H3 here, the bootcamp guide is now available, goes above the form. And we see how that sort of changes over time as our width of our device changes. So what I've done is I've actually created a new HTML web page here in the context of our project thus far. And I've essentially duplicated the markup and some of the basic styling so that we can talk about some of the strategies for responsive design. In the first, we've touched upon a fair bit amount in the past, and it's really about creating flexible layouts. And we create flexible layouts by using EM, REM, and percentage-based units. So if we wanted to get the default behavior that we're seeing here of having the H3 bootcamp guide is now available showing up on top, and then the sort of input in the button showing underneath it, we could go ahead and do so. Let's actually change our responsive layout to get more towards the larger resolution display. And we're going to use this style to essentially emulate using a flexible layout to basically have our H3 live on the same line as our field set here. So what I've done is I've kind of imported this HTML, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to create a similar experience using a flexible percentage-based layout to get the same effect here. So let's take a look at how we may accomplish something like that. Well, first, what we need to do is we need to understand the CSS at which we're dealing with. So what I've done is I've incorporated some basic CSS that emulates a lot of the styling that we're seeing here in this bootcamp guide is now available. You'll see the bolding here. The color actually looks just a little bit off. So we're going to actually modify that H3 to also have the same color as what's displayed and represented in the input itself. But essentially what we're doing is we've just supplied sort of our basic font coloring and background colors. I've also added a border around the field set that we're dealing with. So if we look at actually the CSS and the markup together in one screen, one thing that's really cool about Atom actually is that you can set up what's known as panes. So I'm going to actually split our display here so that you can see some of the CSS alongside the HTML that I've added. So I've gone ahead and imported and adapted some basic HTML to basically represent the same concept, and I've stylized that HTML in accordance with a similar aesthetic to what we have on the launchacademy.com website. But what I want to do is I want to get this H3 to show up alongside this div. And in order to do that, I need to change the display behavior of both my H3 and my div. If you remember from our previous episode, H3s and divs have what's known as block behavior. And it's going to clear on both sides so that the block level element is going to occupy the full width of its container. So we'll see here that our H3, and we're going to turn the device toolbar off for right now. You'll see that the H3 spans the full width of our browser. And similarly, the div for the bootcamp guide also does the same. Now watch what happens as I decrease the size to a really silly kind of width. So if we actually embiggen this a little bit using Command+, and then I decrease the width. Notice how the browser itself does some good things for us in terms of creating a flexible layout. By default, a block level element is going to try to occupy the full width available to it within its container. So if my container for my H3 is smaller than the available width of the text, it's going to essentially do the equivalent of word wrap here and essentially span 2 lines. But what we need to do in order to get these items showing up side by side with one another, first we need to define that we don't want the H3 and the div to follow that normal block behavior, or we could set a default width. So watch what happens when I set my width on my H3 to 50%. And this is really what we're talking about at the core of flexible layouts, is we're using percentage-based units to specify things like width, padding, and other box level properties. Now notice, because my H3 is a block level element, it's still going to clear on both sides of the element. We have a width here specified of 50%, and you see that the box itself actually spans that 50%. But because it's an H3 block level element, what we're seeing here is that it's going to clear to the left and the right of it. And similarly, if we add this to the div, I think actually we'll get differing behavior. So we want to essentially set the bootcamp guide panel to also have a width So this bootcamp form container, we're going to also set to have a width of 15%. And let's see if that changes our behavior. Notice how it changes the container of in the border here of our field set, but notice that the H3 is still on its own line and the field set is still on its own line. So what we need to do is we actually need to define the display property for each of these elements. And in this case, I'm going to use an inline block. And an inline block kind of provides us with the best of both worlds of being able to use some block level characteristics in terms of observing things like padding and margin in a way that we would expect, but not necessarily clearing on the left and the right of these elements. So we've changed the display from the default of block for H3 and for the div to essentially take advantage of the ability of a flexible layout here. So watch what happens now when I refresh the page. We have to account for things like margin and padding. So we may, for example, set the width of our H3 to 45%. Now we're getting behavior that is at least a little bit more resemblant of what we have on the Launch Academy webpage. And that's because I needed to account for padding and margin as part of my sort of responsive design approach. And this is part of the idea of creating a flexible layout. Essentially, you have to consider that you always have 100% availability of width. But if you are in a container where you have to also account for things like padding and margin, a 50-50 split is not going to work well for you. So often what you need to do is you need to set things like a 49% or a 50% to get an even split. And really, I think that stems from the border here actually taking up part of the width of the available real estate of our HTML document here. So I wanted to point that out as an important thing to consider when creating a flexible layout. Your flexible layout essentially has to not only consider the width of your elements, but also their padding and margin and border as well, taking us back to some of the box model mechanics that we've talked about in previous episodes. So that's great. We've got ourselves a little bit closer to the paradigm of what we're going for here. Now let's try to get the button to display inside the input. So notice here that this is also clearing, and we're seeing a div inside the field set. So I'm going to get rid of some of this extraneous markup so that we can just deal with the form elements themselves. And if this is the first time that you're seeing the input in the button elements, I recommend checking both of them out on the MDN website. You'll notice in my CSS, we had to override some default behaviors, and that comes from the user agent style sheet. And that's essentially us trying to make our input, a little more aesthetically pleasing in the context of our web project. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add some additional padding to our field set, or actually our bootcamp guide panel, so we can get a little bit better of an effect here. Now notice in adding that padding, I've now affected my width calculations, so I probably need to bring this down a bit. There we go. All right. So now we're getting a nice effect. I want to also get a little bit of white space on the top of our field set here. So let's find out how we can go about doing that. So notice the H3 has some padding by default, but our bootcamp guide form container does not have any padding. So I'm going to add some vertical padding to that field set. Our bootcamp guide container, it's actually a div. So we're going to say padding, and I'm going to actually not specify any horizontal padding, so we don't have to mess with our width calculations anymore. Oh, I transposed my paddings. So this is top and bottom padding, and this is left and right padding. And there we go. Now we've got a little more white space here and the subtle background difference between our input in our field set and the background there. Great. Okay, but what we want is we want this get the guide to be on the same line as our input here. So in order to do that, we've got to get rid of some of this extraneous markup. Which we've done. And now what we want to do is we want to essentially get our display so that our button does not clear. So let's find out how we could go about doing that. So the input gives us the space that we want, and then the button gives us the space that we want. So we just need to refresh the page. And it looks like we still have some div. Oh, I needed to save my HTML document here. Okay, there we go. Okay, now they're getting so that they're displaying in a way that makes sense. But now what I need to do is I need to actually increase my input so that the width of that input occupies as much percentage as possible without breaking. So I might do something like a 75 to 25% mix. Now, if you notice, from our previous exercise, we may run into an issue here because we're setting our padding of our button and we're also setting exactly 100% worth of width in the available real estate. Let's see what happens. So as you may guess, now we get this break and it almost looks like a hard return between our button and our input. So what I need to do is I need to consider the padding as part of the available real estate and actually set this to something like 24%. And really what we should be doing when thinking about flexible media and flexible layout is we want to consider actually and be consistent with the units that we're using. So we might in fact actually move or change our padding to actually be percentage based. So now we're accurately considering the full percentage of available real estate inside this div, and it's going to respond to the available width available in our browser. And we get some default behavior as our web page changes that is actually advantageous for the most part. But you can see how things start to sort of break down as we start to use a flexible layout. It doesn't always give us the granularity of customization that we want. So web developers being smart and the W3C being smart, we realized that there was really a need to go even more granular and have more control over how we style our web pages for differing devices. So thankfully, we have this wonderful world of media queries as an opportunity to essentially highlight and handle for differing resolutions and features that are available to us in a particular web page. So with media queries, what we can do is we can specify conditions and nest CSS rules under those conditions to basically target various resolutions and capabilities of our web browsers. Before we dive into the specifics of setting up our media queries, let's kind of decompose what a typical media query looks like. So if we were going to essentially handle for this behavior and essentially get the same behavior as what we see here in the context of the Launch Academy website, come on, adjust. There we go. Let's just change to S5 and refresh the page. A little slow to catch up here. All right, so when we are seeking this kind of display, we want to handle things differently. And we can do so through the use of media queries. So what we're doing here is basically saying that for resolutions that are less than, essentially, we break, let's see here, we'll change it to responsive. Watch when the change occurs. It looks like right at 700 pixels is when that change occurs. Let's see. At 1,000 pixels, we start to see that wrap occur. So we want to essentially specify a media query condition that is going to allow us and target a smaller resolution. So what we're going to do is we're going to specify a media query. And a media query looks exactly like this. So let's break this down. Good idea to use parens here. And essentially, the first piece of our media query is specifying condition. The first condition is that we're not using a screen reader, and we're considering a visual readable sort of device. So this is targeting specifically sort of visual based browsers. Remember from our early days of talking about accessibility that it's very easy to consider the fact that 95 to 96% of browsers are visual in nature. But what we do in doing so is we essentially do not consider those that are visually impaired. So CSS provides us with mechanisms to basically highlight and target only the visual natured browsers, which we're doing here. So what we're doing in our media query is saying for any visual browser that has a maximum available width of 1,000 pixels, everything inside these curly braces we're going to want to apply. So watch what happens if, for example, I move some of these CSS properties inside the media query. So for example, if I say that I only want to set, actually we're gonna set this to min width. And we're gonna do the same for our bootcamp guide panel. We're gonna move the width and display rules inside this media query. And essentially what we're doing is we're saying we only want to apply these CSS rules if we're dealing with a browser window that exceeds 1,000 pixels. So let's see what happens now when we actually integrate this and we refresh the page. So what we want is we want this, and we'll set and, oh, I have a syntax error here. That's what I was looking for. Bootcamp guide, bootcamp, oh, I have this inline block still remaining here. We want to remove that. All right, so what I want to do here is I want this behavior when I'm at smaller resolutions, and I want the side-by-side behavior when I'm at larger resolutions. So let's find out why our media query is not functioning that way. So notice here how we have, using the media queries debugger, we can see that we have a tripwire there, but it appears that our inline block elements are not getting appropriately styled. So let's inspect the element and take our width beyond 1,000 pixels. Oh, I think I know the issue here. The form container is set to width 50%, and the Bootcamp Guide panel is inappropriately set to, with the width. So we actually want to set this on the H3 tag. I forgot the H3 tag here in terms of specificity, so let's do that again. So now we get the affected and intended result with our media query here. Essentially what we're doing is we're saying for only browsers that have a min width of 1,000 pixels, meaning anything that is greater than 1,000 pixels, we want to apply the styling rules between lines 2 and lines 10. So you can see how this changes the behavior once we hit that what's known as a breakpoint in the layout. We see that once we cross the threshold of 1,000 pixels, we get that new CSS behavior. And when we go below 1,000 pixels, we get the default behavior of the H3 and the div. And that's really at the cornerstone of our responsive design principles. We love this kind of functionality because we can now target different widths as part of our overall approach. And let's talk a little bit about other important elements of responsive design. So we touched upon in the HTML boilerplate episode how important it is to set the viewport. And by default, we set the viewport based on the fully available width of the device. And we set the initial scale to 1. Now with touch devices, like our iOS and Android devices and tablet devices, we can actually pinch to zoom. And we may want to restrict how far a user can in fact do that. But by default, we always want to kind of set this viewport to use the default device width as available width in the initial scale to 1. We can, in fact, if we wanted to, actually disable zooming as part of the responsive design experience. And we can set things like user scalable equals no. And this basically tells the mobile web browser that the user cannot pinch to zoom or zoom out. We can also set a default zoom anywhere between 1 and 10. But generally, we're always going to set this to 1. Watch what happens when we change the viewport. Notice that when the browser came up, it was very heavily zoomed. And then the Chrome tool is actually resetting the viewport for us. But this is what you would get, this experience is what you would get with a default scale of 5. So generally, we want to always set that initial scale to 5. We can constrain the width, the available zooms for the user based on setting the min scale and the minimum scale in the maximum scale. And essentially this restricts the range at which zoom can happen. So these are important knobs and dials that you can configure and incorporate as part of your overall responsive design project. Generally though, you're always going to end up with what the boilerplate supplies, and really being restrictive of the way in which a user can zoom on their mobile devices actually impedes accessibility. So you want to really shy away from disabling zoom or really constraining zoom using the viewport tag. So generally this default isn't considered reasonable for the most common of use cases. The other thing that I wanted to mention about media queries and things like zooming is that remember that we have to consider the use case of using older browsers to browse the web. This idea of media queries and responsive web design is a relatively new concept for the internet. So what we must do is consider the possibility of users using older browsers in the context of experiencing our responsive web designs. So what we must use is what's known as a polyfill to ensure we still provide an optimal experience for those that are using older web browsers. So thankfully, our buddy Scott over at Filament Group has created a wonderful polyfill that basically makes our media queries backwards compatible for old web browsers like Internet Explorer 7 and Internet Explorer 8. So we want to incorporate this, and in order to do so, what we can do is we can just download this JavaScript and place it in our vendor directory. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. So when you're incorporating third-party JavaScript into your HTML documents, generally in development, you want to actually include the non-minified version. But since we're dealing with a third-party JavaScript file, we can actually use the min file and basically save all of the white space and basically just incorporate this into our HTML document. So I'm going to go to GitHub, and I'm going to pull up the min JavaScript file, and I'm going to click the raw button, and this is going to give us all the code that we need to basically provide backwards compatibility for using media queries. So I'm going to select all, and I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to actually include it in my vendor directory, and I'll just call it response.js, and I'll copy and paste all of that code so that it's available to us. And then I'm going to actually incorporate it into our Bootcamp Guide HTML webpage. And I'm going to put it at the bottom of my body tag. And this essentially makes all of the responsive media query stuff that we've done here backwards compatible. So if I pull up my web page using Internet Explorer 7 or Internet Explorer 8, these media queries will take effect. And this is known as a polyfill because it essentially makes such functionality backwards compatible in the context of older browsers. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about the practices of responsive design. So notice how we started from the perspective of a wider resolution. Well, what's becoming even more so popular in regular practice is the concept of mobile-first design. So one thing that I would encourage you to do as you start to build out your responsive designs is to first consider the mobile view of your HTML web page. Through the proliferation of mobile devices, and really the future of the web is really focused on this idea of creating optimal experiences for mobile devices. And it's actually easier to deal with constrained widths first and expand out your thinking as you work through your responsive designs. So the idea of starting at small resolutions and working your way out to larger resolutions is really fundamental to the practice of responsive web design. So we call that mobile first design because we're considering the smallest resolutions first. So something to consider as you work through your markup here. So that's a crash course in responsive web design. There's a lot more detail that we can go through, but thankfully we're going to be doing so by example in the next set of lessons. So in the past, I've been asking you and cautioning you that we were going to come up to a place where it was important for you to have your resume ready. Well, essentially, I'm excited to share that in the next episode, we're going to be practicing all of the things that we've taught together to basically build a responsive resume. And from there, we're going to integrate a practical project, actually the web page for this course, and we're going to actually use all of these principles from HTML and CSS to responsive web design and writing accessible compliant markup. All of that is going to be incorporated in the projects of building a responsive resume and later building a landing page for this course. So I hope you'll join me, and we'll continue to kind of put these practices and concepts to work as we dive deeper into the course. I did want to share that, unfortunately, in next episode, we're going to have to wait until Tuesday. So there won't be a session on Thursday, this coming Thursday. I'm actually going to be away at a conference, but I hope you'll join us as we start to dive in to this practice of building a responsive resume. And lastly, in closing, I wanted to talk a little bit about last week's episode and where we went wrong with some of the markup. To do so, let's go back and revisit the actual HTML that we were working with. And we're going to turn off the inspector here and the device toolbar. And if you remember, I was dealing with some non-compliant markup in terms of our HTML here. So what I did after we signed off for the day is I took this markup and I sent it through the W3C validator. And using our debugging tools, I was able to isolate the offending element. Thankfully, using the W3C validator, I found out that I had an open div tag that was not closed. So if we go back to the markup and actually look at what happened there, it turns out on line 69, I had an open div tag that was not closed. And it turns out that my intent was to actually have this tag on line 68 be a closing tag. So I had a typo in my markup. So it's a wonderful real world example of how the validation tools and the Chrome inspector and things like that can really help us to become better developers. So don't forget to use your tools, and don't forget to get to the fundamentals of what we've been teaching to date. And as always, I hope you'll join us in Slack and show your work. What I'd love for you to do is take your web page that you've been building throughout the course and incorporate some media queries so that your web page behaves and adapts appropriately to changing resolutions of your browser. And also, I want you to modify your table that you've incorporated to use percentage-based layout or a flexible layout so that it essentially handles for the changing resolution of your browser window. Using flexible layouts and media queries will allow you to manage and handle different devices through the practice of responsive design. So I hope you'll continue to put that practice at work, and we're going to do plenty more practice and exercises around this concept as we dive deeper into the more project-oriented portion of the course. I hope to see you and talk to you about that in Slack, and as always, if you have any questions, please send them my way. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.